Kalispera, Saska, Kelasodisete, bonsoir, bienvenue, good evening and welcome. Normally I introduce myself at this point, but I think you all know who I am. Anyway, I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Margaret Aiken. Maggie holds a BA and an MA in Anthropology from the University of Alberta and a PhD in Life, Earth and Environmental Sciences from the University of Copenhagen, with a thesis entitled Exploitation and Collapse of Black Sea Marine Fauna. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Population Analysis and Monitoring at the Swedish Museum of Natural History and adjunct graduate faculty in the Department of Anthropology at Trent University, Ontario. She also sits on our Institute's Board of Directors, where she currently serves as Membership Secretary. Maggie's research focuses on biomolecular archaeology and the exploitation of animal resources in the past, with a particular interest in marine mammals. Her doctoral work explored the prehistoric and historic cetaceans in the Black Sea region. I've never said that word before. And her current research focuses on the critically endangered Baltic proper harbour porpoise. She has been involved in fieldwork projects in Greece, Poland, China and Canada, and has worked on our Institute's Central Achaia Phthiotis survey project since 2019, after first coming to Greece as a field school student at another of our projects at Chalcolithica in 2017. This evening, Maggie will give a lecture entitled Hunting Dolphins in the Black Sea, a Zooarchaeological Perspective. Maggie.
Hello. Thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction. I also didn't know how to say cetacean when I interviewed for my PhD position, and I had to look it up on Google right before the interview to make sure I was saying it right. So I think that's common, or we can share that. My name is Maggie. Today I'm going to be presenting a chapter of my PhD, which I did at the University of Copenhagen, co-supervised by Morten Tange Olsen at the University of Copenhagen and Pavel Golden at the National Academy of Science in Ukraine. It says dolphins at the top, but it's because I didn't want to say cetaceans. We're going to be talking about two species of dolphins, the common dolphin and the bottlenose dolphin, as well as a porpoise, the harbor porpoise. So a little bit of context about what my PhD was more generally interested in. As Jonathan mentioned, it was entitled The Exploitation and Collapse of Black Sea Marine Fauna. And I was interested in a few different topics. So I started looking specifically at the colonization. So when did the cetaceans, the dolphins, and the porpoises enter the Black Sea? And I did that using ancient DNA, as well as zooarchaeological methods. I then became very interested in the exploitation aspect, which is what I'll be talking about today. From some of the work that I was doing on exploitation, I became really curious about how the environment had changed in the Black Sea over a period of about 8,000, 9,000 years. So I used stable isotope analysis, comparing ancient and modern harbor porpoises and dolphins to see how their niche has changed, how their diets have changed over time, and how that's a reflection of past ecosystems and modern changes. The Black Sea is a really cool ocean. It's very strange, it's very small, and it's very young. It only became connected to the global ocean system about 8 to 9,000 years ago. Before then, it was an isolated completely, and it was mostly kind of brackish, like a slightly salty lake. But in this period, about 9,000 years ago, rising water levels in the Mediterranean and the ocean systems more generally allowed the Mediterranean via this box right here to basically flow into the Black Sea, making it saline for the first time. This makes it really interesting if we're looking ecologically and archaeologically, because it means that humans already were settled around most of the whole coastline before it became marine. So none of these species existed in this body of water, and at some point the water breached and they were able to enter. Ecologically, this is interesting. It means that the Black Sea has a very low salinity, with parts of the Sea of Azov up here freezing over in the winter because the sea salinity levels are so low. And it has large anoxic waters, so about 90% of the water by volume doesn't have any oxygen in it, which makes for a really interesting biodiversity. Everything has to be kind of in this top layer of the water. Archaeologically, there's a lot to talk about if we're going to look at the whole Black Sea region. Humans first started occupying the Black Sea region in the early to mid-Pleistocene, so about 2.1 to 1.8 million years ago. These are stone tools that they left right around here. After that, there is a huge amount of cultures that have occupied this area. It's been a really interesting place where people have both come together and then also very violently separated at other points. In terms of what we're interested in a Mediterranean context, Greek settlements start popping up as colonies in about the 8th century, and we see the Roman annexation of some of those cities later on, starting in about 72 BCE, with some cities being annexed and some being taken as client states. Some maps. Okay. If we're going to talk about the cetaceans, you should probably meet them. So we have the bottlenose dolphin, the harbor porpoise, and the common dolphin. All of them are endemic to the Black Sea, so they live there year-round. Some whales also will travel into the Black Sea, but they don't stay for very long. They leave. There's not enough food there for them. All three of these have been proposed to be subspecies of their main species elsewhere, and are significantly smaller in size and often have slightly different diets than what we see elsewhere. Interestingly, the bottlenose dolphin and the common dolphin are both found in the Mediterranean, but the harbor porpoise is not. So at some point, it migrated into the Mediterranean, through to the Black Sea, and then left the Mediterranean for reasons we're not necessarily sure about. We don't know exactly when they all entered the Black Sea, so it must be around this Holocene transition that I mentioned earlier, the 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Based off of zooarchaeological reports, we can see that they first entered the Bosphorus, so this area here, about 8.4 thousand years ago, entering the Black Sea about 7.5, and all species being present in all of the Black Sea about 6.8 thousand years ago. This isn't a perfect measurement system for identifying when they entered the Black Sea because we're relying on the exploitation and then finding them at archaeological sites. And then, as you may know, we then also need to find them, identify them, and then also publish them, all of which are pretty big barriers to them showing up on the map here. But we can say sometime between 8.5 and 7,000 years ago, they entered the Black Sea successfully. There are a few ecological considerations that we have to take into account. We're talking about exploitation over time and how this could impact modern populations. So the first one that I'll talk about is shifting baseline syndrome. So this was first proposed by Daniel Pauly in 1995. He was a fisheries management expert in the US. And he was interested in what he saw as a generational loss of memory. So the idea is that if you start your fisheries management career in 1995, you'll see all the fish that are there and you'll think this is the baseline, this is what we want to preserve too. But in fact, that might already have been heavily exploited. So maybe if we look back farther in time, it's actually a foundational baseline that's much larger than the anthropogenically altered one. So we can see that this here, this is a study from terrestrial mammals in Canada, and when they set their baseline for population size at 1970, the population looks like it probably has stayed relatively stable. When they tried setting a baseline on historic data back to 1850, the population has declined from maybe like 15% down to over 50% decline. So this isn't a small issue, and it means that conservation efforts can set really too low of baselines with targets that are set purely because we don't know what population size looked like in the past. This becomes really important in places like the Black Sea because There has been huge fisheries and exploitation of dolphins and porpoises from the 1940s through to the 80s. We don't know exactly how many cetaceans were killed. We have records, but they aren't divided by species, and they're listed by weight. But it's estimated that somewhere between 2 and 5 million cetaceans were killed during this period. They were used for leather, blubber. The blubber is used for oil and perfumes and things like that. Before this, we know that people were also exploiting dolphins in the Black Sea, but we don't really know what that looks like. There's evidence that people knew that the dolphins were there. Occurs in like textual sources, as well as these cool these are like a bronze proto-currency and then actual currency from a little bit later. But we don't know what the actual exploitation looked like. Archaeologically, knowing how people exploited the dolphins and porpoises in the Black Sea becomes really important when we talk about subsistence. In the Black Sea, we don't really know almost anything about past subsistence beyond what was traded out to the Mediterranean. So we know that salt fish, honey, grain was really important, as well as lumber. They probably weren't eating that though, but these are the things that were being taken out. Beyond that, there hasn't necessarily been a lot of interest because this is what was arriving in Athens, and that's what we generally have cared about. But we do, of course, know that the choices that people make about their food is not just about the food that they're eating, it's also about the risks that they're willing to take, about technology, it's about labor. So not knowing any of these things is kind of a big gap in our knowledge. In terms of the Greeks and the Romans, we also have really interesting questions about how do Greek colonists and then later the Romans change subsistence patterns when they move outside of their original regions. It looks like very generally that the Romans don't really change their diet that much. They kind of have a standard diet that they bring places, and that perhaps the Greeks do something a little bit different, but we also don't know how this adapts into the Black Sea. So here I had two main questions. I wanted to see if there is evidence for historic or prehistoric exploitation of Black Sea marine mammals in the zooarchaeological record, and if there are, can I see any patterns in their exploitation? So to do this, I gathered all of the zooarchaeological reports from the Black Sea that are published and also in gray literature that I got access to. Most of these were in Ukrainian and Russian, neither of which I speak, so it was a lot of translating lists of faunal remains. And then we used the data from these site reports to examine the prevalence across the whole region from the Mesolithic to the medieval period. We used NISP in this, which is the number of identifiable specimens. This is just a simple count of all of the bones that belong to, in this case, a specific species. So all of the harbor porpoise bones get counted individually. This is normally used for highly fragmented collections, which is what we normally have when we're looking at midden depositions. But you can use things like minimum number of individuals, MNI for animals. It just becomes very tricky when you have so few, because what this does is this is an estimated number of individuals. So it takes things like duplication to an account. For example, if we had a made-up faunal assemblage here, the NISP is just, you add up all of the numbers. For MNI, you're looking for how many is the minimum number that could be here. And since there's 8 left arm bones and each animal only has 1 left arm bone, there's a minimum of 8 animals that could be present. This is 2 different ways to try to get to the same point, which is the actual number of individuals, and we have no idea how this works. This is a theoretical target. So we can say that maybe this faunal assemblage in the past would have represented 10 individuals, but we actually don't know this. So we're just trying to find methods that give us a best approximation. But for this, I use NISP. And what we see is that there's 27 sites in the Black Sea where we were able to get archaeological or zooarchaeological material and reports from. You can see that there is a, okay, I'll start. What this is showing here is for each site, oh, I need to be close to this. For each site, you're giving, it's a timeline for each site, And then the different colors on the timeline are showing roughly how many bones were a part of each assemblage. You can see that parts around here are heavily, some would maybe say overrepresented. There are just a lot of archaeological sites here, and I was also working very closely with Ukrainian colleagues who had access to gray literature that we don't get from other regions. What we can also see is that while there are some sites that have kind of a bit of a diachronic data for most sites we're only getting 1, maybe 2 time periods. And the Roman and the Hellenistic are the most highly represented time periods. You'll probably notice very quickly that this whole southern part of the Black Sea is missing, and that's actually very sad because there are a lot of ancient sources and modern documents that suggest that there's a lot of exploitation of cetaceans in this area, but unfortunately we don't seem to have any reports from there. There are some very important archaeological sites, but they haven't published, and they weren't being keen to share their data, which is very fair. But I would expect there to be much more activity along this southern coast or northern coast of Turkey. So here we visualized just kind of the data that's available. So this is all the faunal data. So this includes cows and pigs and sheep and goats and everything. Then we wanted to look and start to pull apart exactly what animals we're seeing. And so to do that, we made a ranked order map. The unfortunate thing when using NISP is that it's something called an ordinal scale, so you can't just compare percentages across. The numbers don't work like normal numbers, which is very frustrating. But what you can do instead is you can give them a rank order. So somewhere like this top site, where there's the highest percent is birds, instead of saying that the highest percent is birds, you can give it rank 1, and then you can compare between sites with these different ranks. And what this lets us do is look throughout all the different time periods. The dolphins show up very nicely on my screen, but I think on the projector they show up barely a little pink, but there's dolphins all of these places, I promise. And so what we can see here is that about 92% of the sites where we have zooarchaeological data in the Black Sea have dolphins or porpoises present. And they're the highest represented. It looks like in this Roman period where all of a sudden dolphins are present at every single archaeological site, or almost every single archaeological site. I guess there's one exception. And seemingly in quite high quantities compared to other times. The only time period that doesn't have any dolphins is this site here, and it's Mesolithic, so it's actually before the waters were saline, so there was no dolphins because they need the salt water. From this, we became really interested in when exactly are dolphins being exploited in time. We know that it looks like there's a lot in the Roman period, but does that kind of hold up when we look at an individual bone-by-bone level? And to do this, we used a frequency estimation, and this is just a way to visualize the data. To do all of the rest of these analyses, we had to put everything into chronological periods, so everything had to be classical or Hellenistic or Roman, which is really great for those analyses, but it means that we've boxed all of them in. So if there's something that's at the end of the Chalcolithic, how do we know when in the Chalcolithic it happened, essentially? So what we did here is we used a distribution model to incorporate the site-specific dating. The way that this works is pretty simple. If we made a fake, that's really high, a fake example site of 25 bones, they occupied the site for 50 years, you would have on average 0.5 bones per year being, like making it its way into the faunal assemblage. We know that this isn't real. People weren't only getting half a dolphin bone per year, but it's a way to try to split up, especially when we have these really long time periods. It worked really well in kind of this like more recent period. It worked really poorly in the Chalcolithic because all of the sites are dated to really long time periods. So even though we are trying to avoid kind of this boxing of sites, we end up with literally 3 boxes. But we do see from this 2 periods that do seem to have peaks in exploitation or bone presence at least. So the first is in this Chalcolithic period, where we see all three species present. And we're not entirely sure why this is. We do have a few thoughts. The first is that during this Chalcolithic is the porpoises and dolphins have fully moved into the Black Sea at this point, and people had time to fully adapt to new coastal saline environments. So it could be that they're being more at ease and figuring out how to exploit animals that perhaps weren't there before. We know that the modern oceanography isn't met until about 900 years after the breach. So this lines up very roughly with these animals perhaps being present in larger numbers. We also see a peak and the Roman period, where stations are recovered from most all of the Roman sites. The peaks are the largest. We also have the largest amounts of faunal bones from these sites. They tend to have better preservation, and there's a few studies that excavated like 4 or 5 sites all at once, and they have beautiful data that we don't quite get from some of the earlier periods. So this could be a little bit of bias as well. This is interesting in the Roman period because this contrasts with a more homogeneous diet that we see elsewhere in the Roman world. We don't see Romans hunting dolphins elsewhere. There's definitely some in the UK, but those are bigger whales, and it seems to be opportunistic. Maybe off on the Iberian coast a little bit, but again, those are large whales and not these smaller dolphins. One of the reasons this could be is this is happening during a big population expansion. The Black Sea doesn't have olives, so they don't have olive oil. It was being traded in from the Mediterranean, but it could be that they start hunting more harbor porpoises as a need for oil increases. People could have very easily been hunting the dolphins. I get this question a lot. They're not very big. Harbor porpoises in the Black Sea can be just about this big. People catch fish that are much bigger, and we know that archaeologically as well. In the Black Sea, there's pretty stable hunting technology from about the Archaic to the medieval period. There's gill nets and purse seining that's available. So you have nets. Harbor porpoises love to be caught in nets accidentally. They follow fish into the nets and they get grabbed up. It's still a problem, and it seems to have been a problem in the past as well. Archaeologically, we have evidence that these are weights for nets, and there's really small weights for nets, and there's also, in the Black Sea, we find very large ones, which is suggesting that whatever type of nets they were using, they were also quite large, and definitely capable of catching a harbor porpoise or a dolphin, either accidentally or on purpose. And we also have evidence for things like fishing line and fishing hooks. There's also harpoons and tridents being used in lagoons and estuaries. We have this from written sources as well. Most of the species do come into really small, shallow waters, so they're able to be caught in lagoons. They don't mind the low salinity water. They go into rivers sometimes, so there is ample opportunity for them to be caught. What's really hard to know from the archaeological record is if they were actively being caught or if it was an accident every time. I think with the numbers that we're seeing at some of the sites, I would have a hard time believing that all of them were accidents, but certainly some could be. Dolphins and porpoises also strand, so they die, they wash up on the coast, and the bones can end up in archaeological sites. This is also not an unknown phenomena. So one of the things we tried to do to look at this was look at comparing the species ratio that we see in the different time periods in the past to the modern distribution to see if it matches what we've seen and what we would kind of have a general expectation of. When we look at the bottlenose dolphins, they make up over a third of the NISP from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, so in these really early time periods. They are known to forage in coastal areas. They've been known to enter estuaries and rivers. So it might be that they show up a lot in these early time periods because they're the easiest to catch. They're along the shore. You can stab one with a trident from a river bank type of thing. We look at the common dolphin. They show up a little bit later, and this is interesting because they have a pelagic habitat, so they're not really near the shore very often. They stay in the middle of the water for the most part, and you probably would have needed a slightly more sophisticated boat to be able to get to where they are, as well as the nets. They also avoid the Kerch Strait area, so that's the area with all of the archaeological sites that we had, because they don't like the low salinity waters as much as some of the other dolphins and porpoises do. And finally, when we look at the harbor porpoise, it's the most represented throughout the zooarchaeological record, and they congregate on the shelf region, but they are known to enter lagoons and estuaries like bottlenose dolphins. They're very small, and they would definitely have been able to be caught. All of this is in really strong contrast with the Mediterranean, where there's very limited evidence for any form of marine mammal exploitation. So this is a map of all of the cetacean bones, like sites with cetacean bones in the Mediterranean. And if we look specifically around Greece, there's hopefully still 6 sites, where we have over 20 in the Black Sea region alone. And we don't really know why this is. The Black Sea is more bioproductive than the Mediterranean. There's more fish. It's why it was economically really important for both the Greeks and the Romans to have colonies there. But people in the Mediterranean would have certainly been capable from the Neolithic period to catch all of these species, but they don't really seem to be interested in that. There are a few exceptions. So kind of down by Gibraltar, there's a number of really old cave sites that have bones, and also whale barnacles, which is kind of cool. But they have bones from there, but there's a lot of really big whales that move in and out through that area, and potentially like calving grounds in the Western Mediterranean. In the Eastern Mediterranean, we see much less, though there should have also been dolphins there in the past. An exception to this is this bone, which was found in the Athenian Agora, and it's a fin whale bone, but it's unclear if it was scavenged or if it was actively hunted. It's cool. It's a scapula. It has some form of cut put in it. It was suggested to maybe be used as a cutting board of some sort, and it's a juvenile, so it's not an adult yet. But yeah, we don't know why they're not in the Mediterranean. For dolphins, part of the reason might be that this idea that there could be some form of sacredness attached to dolphins. Dolphins were regarded as sacred. Their intelligence, devotion to humans was often cited. Their beauty was put into all sorts of textual and iconographic material. And they're well represented as animals, even though we're not seeing them in the archaeological record. Like I said, whales were treated differently. We get a little bit of whales. We don't get dolphins, so this could be one of the reasons that that's happening. But again, it's not very clear, and without more zooarchaeological evidence, it's really hard to say if there's any regional biases that are kind of causing this to happen. Okay. So, in some form of summation, if we take a very long-term view, for 8,500 years, dolphins seem to have been exploited in the Black Sea, and this starts almost as soon as they enter the region. They're present at 92% of the sites, with some of the highest numbers recorded in the world. I think maybe in the Baltic Sea, in the Neolithic, there may have been slightly more, but otherwise the numbers are incredibly high for in the Black Sea, in a region where otherwise we're not really assuming we're going to see it. We see two peaks, one in the Chalcolithic and one in the Roman period. One is probably ecological, and the other is probably or likely a need for oil, though people were likely also eating the dolphin meat as well. And while it's very difficult to say if dolphins are being actively exploited or if they're just kind of showing up in strandings or in bycatch, there does seem to be enough bones that this seems rather unlikely, and that instead what we're seeing is some form of exploitation with continuity into the medieval period and through to the historic period, or the more historic period as well. This work is still partially ongoing, so I'm still working on the ancient DNA results and the stable isotope, and I'm hoping to move into some new projects that can also kind of shed some light on these questions. So the first one is a grant application that I'm waiting to hear back on right now, and I have all of my fingers crossed. So I'm interested in garum from the Black Sea. There's huge salt processing fish plants in the Black Sea, and salt fish was traded through to the Mediterranean. The samples, so when it's all dried and archaeological now, this is what we get. It's just a pile of little tiny bones. And so what I'm interested in is looking at the species composition. So I want to use ancient DNA as well as proteomics, so zooms, to identify the different species. And I'm hoping using a combination of morphological identification, proteomics, and ancient DNA that I can also identify animals that don't have skeletal remains anymore. So there's the small fish, they would have put the whole fish in, but for bigger fish like tuna or maybe dolphins, they would have used the entrails, so like the guts would have been put in and salted. And I'm hoping that I can, if it's there, I'll be able to identify species that we don't have the physical bones of anymore. The other project that I am very keen on is looking at lamps in the Black Sea. So if cetaceans were being exploited for their oil, we would expect to see that in the lipid analysis residue left on lamps. We know that this was happening in the Black Sea later, so in the 17th century, we get like Ottoman Turkish explorers talking about dolphin oil using as illuminants for a whole lighthouse. In the 1700s, a French botanist, of all people, were talking about oil being exported outside of the Black Sea to be used as illuminant as well. So I think this would be an interesting way as well to see how these animals were being used beyond just their bones being present at the archaeological sites. Thank you very much for being here and for listening. I want to thank both my PhD supervisors, Dr. Morten Tangel Olsen and Dr. Pavel Golden, as well as all my co-authors, my funding, which was from Marie Curie and the Carlsberg Foundation in Denmark. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. Are there questions, comments? If so, I'll bring the microphone over.
I have a question. I don't think I need a microphone.
We need to use the microphone for the people watching online.
Oh, okay. Hi. I come from the humanities, and I'm baffled by the use of the word exploitation. Is it fishing? Is it overfishing? Is it badly fished about? I mean, to me, it sounded really negative throughout the chat. And it seems to be naturalized exploitation of cetaceans. Ha ha. Thank you.
Yeah, the term exploitation does just mean like hunting or fishing. It takes into account that there's lots of different ways that these animals could be killed, essentially, and used in the past. I think it's actually not the first time that I've been told this, that it sounds really negative. I think it's very common in certain literature to use that as like a standard term, but I do think you're right that it does have, or it can sound like it has a connotation that I don't mean for it to.
So basically it was fishing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Why did you say fish?
Well, because you don't normally fish marine mammals.
Okay.
Yeah.
Exploit them.
Yes.
Thank you.
Of course.
I know you're using data from other archaeological sites, but are there any studies of cut marks, butchering practices, anything that gives some hints of how these carcasses were being processed or used?
Yeah, so there's a few of the reports mention mostly like butchery marks. It's found in a few of the Ukrainian sites. There's a study ongoing in Ukraine that some of my PhD supervisors, collaborators working on, but it's been on hold for the last few years now.
I wonder why.
Yeah, it did mean I was supposed to go do field work in Ukraine, and then COVID happened, and then Russia invaded, and then kind of just had to leave
Yes.
that for now.
Well, you've done a remarkable job with recovering a topic in those circumstances.
Thank you.
Any more?
Thanks, Maggie. You talked about at the start how we don't know much about the subsistence patterns of people in the Black Sea and how that's kind of a huge gap in the scholarship. I'm just curious whether you know, is anyone trying to address that gap that you've seen? Are there movements towards understanding how they subsisted?
Yeah, there's been a few like small stable isotope studies, mostly in Bulgaria and Romania, I believe. Farther, like north, especially in Ukraine and into Russia, there's less being done currently, and a lot of that is because so many of the sites are culturally very distinct, especially in the Neolithic period, which is, I think, of a lot of interest right now. So most of what's been done has been like the publishing of faunal assemblages, from which mostly what's been said is they were eating animals to some extent or not. I think as part of this project, so I have like spreadsheets and spreadsheets of not just the dolphins and the porpoises, but also all of the fauna that were recovered. So I would like to go back through and see if there's any patterns in that, but I haven't gotten there yet.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Any more? If not, we can continue the discussion informally over a glass of wine in the adjoining rooms. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.